I didn't inherit anything. That's what makes my story different from the ones you usually hear. The ones about girls who get a letter from a lawyer saying some forgotten relative left them a piece of land. Nobody left me anything. Nobody remembered me at all. What I got because I had $1 in my pocket and the stubbornness to spend it on the worst piece of land in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. A 2-acre lot on the backside of Grassy Cove that nobody wanted because of the spring. The spring was the problem. Or rather, what the spring did was the problem. It came up out of the ground at the base of a limestone bluff, flowing from a crack in the rock into a pool about 10 feet across, and the water was blue. Not the blue of a clear sky reflected in clean water. Blue like something was wrong with it. A deep, luminous, almost glowing blue that shifted toward turquoise in direct sunlight and toward indigo in shade. It looked poisonous. It looked cursed. It looked like something a fairy tale would warn you about. The pool in the forest that the witch tells you never to drink from. People in Grassy Cove had been avoiding that spring for as long as anyone could remember. The land around it had changed hands a dozen times since the 1890s, each owner holding it for a shorter period than the last, before selling it to the next fool for less than they'd paid. By 1937, when I walked into the county assessor's office in Pikeville with a crumpled dollar bill and asked what I could buy, the lot was assessed at 75 cents and hadn't had an owner in 3 years. "That's the Blue Spring lot," said the clerk, a tired man named Mr. Henshaw. He looked at me, 16 years old, thin as a fence rail, wearing a dress that was 2 inches too short because I'd grown and it hadn't. And he said, "You don't want that land, girl." "Why not?" "The water's bad. Blue like that means copper or sulfur or something worse. Nothing grows near it. Animals won't drink from it. The last man who owned it tried to run cattle on it, and the cattle wouldn't go near the spring. Stood on the far side of the lot and bawled until he moved them." "But it has water," I said. "It has blue water. That's not the same thing." I paid the $1. I signed the deed, and I walked 4 miles from Pikeville to the back of Grassy Cove to see what I'd bought. Let me tell you who I was before I tell you what I found. My name was Flora Gant. I had been at the Cumberland Mountain Home for Girls in Crossville since I was 9, when my mother died of a fever that the doctor called influenza, but that the mountains called winter. My father was a timberman who'd been crushed by a falling poplar the year before that. No relatives, no money, no options. 7 years at the Cumberland home, where I learned to cook, to sew, to scrub floors, to keep my head down, and to grow things. That last part was the one that mattered. The home had a kitchen garden, and the woman who ran it, Mrs. Hooper, the only person at Cumberland who ever treated me like I had a brain, taught me everything she knew about soil, about seeds, about the invisible war between a plant and the ground it grows in. She taught me to compost, to rotate crops, to read the color of a leaf the way a doctor reads a pulse. She taught me that dirt is not dirt. It's alive, a universe of organisms working together, and if you treat it right, it will feed you forever. Mrs. Hooper died in the winter of 1936. The new garden mistress didn't want a girl who asked questions. The new matron didn't want a girl who spent more time in the soil than in the sewing room. In March of 1937, 3 months before my 17th birthday, they told me to leave. If you want to find out what that blue spring actually was, and why the land that nothing would grow on became the most fertile ground in the entire county, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what came up out of that limestone wasn't poison. It was the opposite of poison. And when I figured out what to do with it, everything changed. The lot was at the end of a dirt track that petered out into a cow path, which petered out into nothing. Grassy Cove is a strange place to begin with, a large sinkhole valley surrounded on all sides by mountains, with a river that flows into the ground and disappears into the limestone at the cove's lower end. The geology is karst, porous rock riddled with caves and underground rivers, and the cove sits in it like a bowl, its water table complicated and unpredictable. My 2 acres were at the cove's eastern edge, where the valley floor met the bluff. It was mostly flat, a good thing, but the soil was thin and rocky, covered in scrub grass and a few stunted cedars that looked like they'd been arguing with the wind their whole lives. There was no cabin, no structure of any kind. The last owner hadn't bothered to build anything. He'd taken one look at the blue water and the dead-looking ground and walked away. I would sleep under a tarp for the first 2 weeks until I could build a lean-to from cedar poles and canvas, and I would sleep in the lean-to for 3 months until Orrin Pate built me a cabin. But that was later. Right now, there was just me and the land and the spring. And at the base of the bluff, flowing from its crack in the limestone with the quiet steadiness of something that had been doing this for millennia, was the blue spring. I approached it the way you approach anything that frightens you, slowly, with my hands visible, as if it might bite. The pool was beautiful. I'll say that plainly, because honesty matters more than drama. Whatever was in that water, whatever mineral or compound turned it that unearthly blue, the result was the most beautiful body of water I had ever seen. The pool was clear to its bottom, maybe 6 feet deep at the center, and the blue wasn't murky or opaque. It was luminous, like light trapped in glass. Small stones on the bottom were visible in perfect detail, coated in a fine blue-white sedite that sparkled faintly. The water overflowed the pool at its lower edge and ran in a narrow stream across my lot, before disappearing into another crack in the ground about 100 yards away. The karst swallowing its own water back, the way it does everything in Grassy Cove. I knelt at the edge and cupped my hands and brought the water to my nose. It didn't smell like sulfur. It didn't smell like copper. It smelled like stone, clean, cold, mineral stone, with something else underneath, something faintly sweet that I couldn't identify. I drank. Mrs. Hooper, if she'd been alive, would have slapped the cup from my hands. You don't drink unknown water. You don't drink blue water. You don't drink water that animals refuse. But Mrs. Hooper was dead, and I was thirsty and desperate, and I had spent 7 years learning to trust my senses. And my senses said this water was clean. It was the coldest water I'd ever tasted, so cold it hurt my teeth and made my chest contract. And it was sweet. Not sugar sweet, but mineral sweet. The way certain spring waters have a sweetness that comes from dissolved limestone and calcium. The blue, whatever it was, had no taste I could detect. The water was simply water. Cold, clean, extraordinary water, wearing a color it had picked up somewhere deep in the mountain. I didn't die. I didn't get sick. I drank from the blue spring every day for the rest of my life, and it never hurt me once. The first thing I planted was a tomato. Not because tomatoes were practical. It was already late April, and I should have started with something hardier. I planted a tomato because Mrs. Hooper had always said that tomatoes were the truest test of soil. A tomato will tell you everything about your dirt, she used to say. Good soil grows a good tomato. Bad soil grows a lie. I had one tomato, seedling. a brandy wine I'd smuggled out of the Cumberland Homes garden in a tin can with holes punched in the bottom. I planted it in the thin soil near the spring, maybe 15 feet from the pool's edge, where the overflow stream kept the ground damp. I watered it with blue spring water from the pool, carrying it in a bucket. Within a week, something was wrong. Or rather, something was incredibly, impossibly right. The tomato plant was growing at a rate I had never seen. Not just growing, exploding. In the first week, it doubled in height. The stem thickened visibly day by day, the leaves broadened and darkened, and the root system, I could see it through the translucent soil at the edge of the tin can, spread with a vigor that seemed almost aggressive, as if the plant had been starving its whole life and had finally found a banquet. By the end of the second week, it was 2 feet tall, with a stem as thick as my thumb and leaves so dark green they were almost black. Oh, green so deep and saturated, it looked artificial, like someone had painted a plant rather than grown one. By the third week, it was flowering, weeks ahead of schedule, producing clusters of yellow blossoms that the bees found from half a mile away. Bees that came in numbers I'd never seen, crawling over the flowers with an urgency that suggested the nectar and pollen from this plant were something special. I stood in front of that tomato plant on my knees and I thought, the water. It has to be the water. I tested my theory the only way I could, by planting more. I put in beans, corn, squash, peppers, lettuce, cucumbers. Half of each I watered with blue spring water. The other half I watered with rainwater I collected in a barrel. Same soil, same sun, same everything except the water. The difference was staggering. The spring-watered plants grew twice as fast, twice as tall, and produced fruit, when it came, that was twice as large and twice as flavorful as the rain-watered controls. The blue spring tomato, when it finally ripened in late June, was the size of a softball, deep red going on purple, and when I bit into it on the cabin steps with juice running down my chin, the flavor was so intense, so concentrated and complex and alive, that I laughed out loud. Not from joy, though there was joy. From shock. From the pure, disorienting shock of tasting something so far beyond what I thought was possible that my brain couldn't process it as real. The water wasn't poison. It was fertilizer. The blue spring was delivering dissolved minerals from deep in the limestone, calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, and trace elements including something I wouldn't be able to identify for years, directly to the root zone of anything I planted near it. The water was, in effect, a liquid multivitamin for plants, brewed by the mountain over millennia and delivered to the surface through a crack in the rock. The reason nothing had grown near the spring before was simple. Nothing had been planted near it. The scrub grass and cedars on the lot were species adapted to poor soil. They didn't need the minerals and didn't respond to them. But cultivated plants, vegetables, fruits, crops bred over centuries to respond to nutrition, went wild with it. The spring wasn't killing the land. It was supercharging it. Nobody had ever thought to grow anything there because everybody assumed the blue water was bad. The cattle hadn't avoided the spring because the water was poisonous. They'd avoided it because the mineral concentration made it taste strange to them, too cold, too sharp, too different from what their instincts recognized as safe. Animals are conservative drinkers. It didn't mean the water was harmful. It meant the water was unfamiliar. The first person to see the garden was a boy named Clyde Akers. Clyde was 14, a farm kid from the other side of the cove who was out hunting squirrels when he wandered past my lot and saw what no one in Grassy Cove had ever seen on that piece of land: green. He stood at the edge of my 2 acres and stared at the tomato plants, now 6 feet tall, staked and heavy with fruit, and the corn that was already tasseling in early July, and the beans climbing their poles like they were trying to reach the sky. And he said, "What did you do to the dirt?" "Nothing," I said. "I just watered it." "With the blue water?" "Yes." Clyde went home and told his father. His father told the neighbors. By the end of the week, 3 families had walked to the back of the cove to see the girl with the blue spring and the impossible garden, and every one of them left shaking their heads. "That water's been there my whole life," said an old farmer named Mr. Ledbetter, holding a brandywine tomato I'd given him and turning it in his hands like he was examining a jewel. "My daddy told me to stay away from it." His daddy told him the same. Everybody knew it was bad water. Everybody was wrong, I said. Mr. Ledbetter bit into the tomato, chewed, swallowed, looked at me with an expression I'd come to know well over the years. The particular face of a person whose certainty has just been demolished by a piece of fruit. "Lord have mercy," he said. "That's the best tomato I've ever eaten." By the autumn of 1937, I had more food than I could eat or store. The Blue Spring Garden was producing at a volume that defied everything I knew about 2 acres of thin mountain soil. The mineral-rich water had transformed the ground itself. The soil near the spring was becoming darker, richer, more alive with each watering, as the dissolved minerals built up and fed the microorganisms that Mrs. Hooper had taught me were the real engine of fertility. Earthworms appeared in soil that had been nearly lifeless. Fungi colonized the beds. The soil went from rocky gray to dark brown in a single season. I sold produce at the Crossroads store in Grassy Cove. Tomatoes, beans, corn, peppers, squash, cucumbers, herbs. The quality was unlike anything the valley had seen. Not just bigger, but better, with a density of flavor and a nutritional richness that people could taste even if they couldn't explain it. Mrs. Ledbetter, who had been canning tomatoes for 40 years, told me my brandywines made a pasta sauce so good, her husband cried at the dinner table. I don't know if that's true, but she told everyone, and it was the kind of story that made people walk 4 miles to buy tomatoes from a 16-year-old girl on a 2-acre lot. I also began selling the water itself. Not as drinking water, people were still nervous about the blue color, but as plant water. I filled jugs from the spring and sold them for a nickel each to home gardeners in the cove who wanted to try it on their own plots. The results were consistent. Anything watered with the Blue Spring grew faster, larger, and more flavorful than the same variety watered with well water or rain. Old Tolliver Husk, the beekeeper from the mountain above, brought his hives to my lot in the second spring because the bees were already finding my garden from a mile away. "Whatever's in your flowers," he told me, "the bees are drunk on it. I've never seen them work this hard." The honey from those hives, amber, thick, with a floral complexity that reflected every plant in the garden, became another product. Blue Spring honey. People couldn't get enough. In the summer of 1939, a professor named Dr. Elliott Crane from the University of Tennessee drove to Grassy Cove to investigate reports of unusual agricultural productivity associated with a mineral spring. He was a geochemist, a scientist who studied the chemistry of water and rock, and he had heard about my garden from the county extension agent, who had heard about it from Mr. Ledbetter, who couldn't stop talking about the tomatoes. Dr. Crane spent 3 days on my lot. He tested the spring water, the soil, the plants, and the fruit. He measured the mineral content of everything. He took samples back to his laboratory in Knoxville and analyzed them with equipment I couldn't have imagined. When he came back a month later, he was vibrating with the quiet excitement of a scientist who has found something genuinely new. "The blue color," he told me, sitting on my cabin porch with his notes spread across his knees, comes from a mineral called vivianite, hydrated iron phosphate. It forms deep in the limestone under anaerobic conditions and dissolves into the water as it passes through. In concentrated form, vivianite is blue. In your spring, the concentration is low enough to be completely harmless, but high enough to tint the water. And the growing? The vivianite is only part of it. Your spring water contains an extraordinary profile of dissolved minerals: calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, iron, manganese, zinc, and several trace elements, at concentrations that are essentially a perfect liquid plant fertilizer. The water has traveled through miles of limestone, dissolving minerals the entire way. By the time it reaches the surface, it's carrying a payload of nutrients that would cost a commercial farmer hundreds of dollars per acre to apply synthetically. And it's been here forever, I said. Millions of years, Dr. Crane confirmed. The spring is fed by an aquifer that runs through some of the most mineral-rich limestone in the southeast. The water you're using fell as rain decades ago, traveled underground through this rock, and arrived at your spring loaded with everything a plant could want. He paused. This is, without exaggeration, the most nutrient-rich natural spring water I've ever tested, and everyone in this valley has been afraid of it because it's blue. He published a paper. It made very little noise in 1939. The world had other things on its mind, but it confirmed what my tomatoes had already proven. The blue spring wasn't a curse. It was a gift that the mountain had been offering for millennia, waiting for someone who was desperate enough, or curious enough, or hungry enough to accept it. I married in 1942. His name was Orrin Pate, a quiet carpenter from Crossville who had first tasted my tomatoes at the Crossroads store and had then walked 4 miles to meet the woman who grew them. He was the kind of man who built things carefully and spoke even more carefully. And when he saw the blue spring for the first time, the luminous pool at the base of the bluff, the water flowing like liquid sapphire, he knelt beside it and put his hand in and held it there for a long time. "It's beautiful," he said. "Why was everyone afraid of this?" "Because it was different," I said. "And people are afraid of different." Orrin built me a proper cabin, 2 rooms, a porch, a summer kitchen. He built raised beds from limestone he quarried from the bluff. He built a channel system that distributed the spring water evenly across the garden. And he built a spring house over the pool, not to hide it, but to protect it, with glass panels in the roof so you could still see the blue glow from inside. Because some things are too beautiful to cover up. We had 4 children. They grew up with blue-tinted fingernails from playing in the spring and with the taste of the best food in Tennessee as their baseline for what normal was. My oldest daughter once went to a church supper in Pikeville and came home bewildered. "Mama," she said, "their tomatoes don't taste like anything." "Those are regular tomatoes," I said. "Ours are blue spring tomatoes. There's a difference." "I don't want regular tomatoes ever." "Then you'd better learn to tend the spring." She did. All 4 of them did. The war years proved the spring's worth to the wider community. When rationing thinned the shelves and families were told to grow their own food, Victory Gardens struggled in the cove's marginal soil, thin, rocky, acidic, the kind of ground that produces stunted corn and bitter beans and makes farming feel like punishment. But my 5 acres, expanded from the original 2 by purchasing the adjacent lots with money from produce sales, produced enough to supply not just my family, but dozens of others. I gave blue spring water to anyone who wanted it for their gardens. I filled jugs for free and lined them up at the crossroads store for people to take. I shared seedlings started in spring water, tomato plants and pepper plants that were already a foot tall and thick-stemmed before they even went into someone else's garden. I held Saturday morning classes at the lot where I taught Mrs. Hooper's methods: composting, rotation, soil health, the invisible world beneath your feet, combined with the spring water that amplified everything tenfold. "You're giving away your advantage," Orrin said once, watching me fill 30 jugs for families I'd never met. "Mrs. Hooper gave me everything she knew," I said. "She didn't charge. She didn't hold back. She said knowledge that isn't shared is knowledge that dies. I think water's the same way." By 1945, nearly every garden in Grassy Cove was using blue spring water, carried in jugs by children who walk the 4 miles as casually as they walk to school. The Cove's food production tripled in a single season. The county extension agent, baffled by the statistics, came to investigate and left with a jug of his own and a bewildered expression that I'd come to recognize as the face of someone whose assumptions had just been overturned by a blue mineral spring and a $1 piece of land. Tolliver, the beekeeper, now 80, had expanded to 12 hives on my property. His bees worked my garden with a devotion that bordered on obsession, returning to the hives laden with pollen and nectar that produced honey unlike anything in the state. The blue spring honey won a ribbon at the state fair in Nashville in 1946, and the judge's notes said it was unlike any honey produced in Tennessee, complex, floral, with a mineral finish that defies description. I kept the ribbon pinned to the cabin wall. It was the first prize I'd ever won for anything, and every time I looked at it, I thought about Mrs. Hooper, who would have been proud, and about Mrs. Arsenault at the home, who would have been confused, and about the clerk, Mr. Henshaw, who had told me I didn't want that land, and who now bought tomatoes from me every Saturday without a trace of irony. Dr. Crane returned in 1950 with a team from the university's agriculture department. They conducted a 5-year study on my land, comparing blue spring irrigation with conventional methods across 12 crop varieties. The results, published in 1955, showed yield increases of 40 to 200% and nutritional density improvements of 30 to 60% in spring irrigated crops. The paper was titled "Mineral Spring Irrigation and Crop Enhancement in Karst Terrain," and it cited my grandfather's tomato as the first documented evidence. I didn't have a grandfather's tomato, of course. I didn't have a grandfather at all. I had a tin can with a brandywine seedling and $1 and a willingness to drink blue water when everyone else said it was poison. Dr. Crane understood this. In the acknowledgments section of his paper, he wrote, "The authors are indebted to Flora Gant Pate, who had the courage to plant where others feared to drink." Orrin died in 1971 on the porch in September with a glass of blue spring water beside him, the same water he'd been drinking every day for 29 years. The same water that had tinted his teeth faintly blue and turned his garden into the envy of every farmer in the cove. I buried him on the lot, near the bluff, where the sound of the spring is constant. That soft, steady murmur of water emerging from stone that had been the background music of our life together for 3 decades. I kept growing, my hands in the soil every morning before coffee, before breakfast, before anything. The blue water running through channels Orrin had built from limestone blocks, cut so precisely they fit without mortar. The garden expanding, producing, feeding, not just my family now, but a community that had organized itself around the spring the way ancient settlements organized themselves around rivers, because water is the first and last necessity, and everything else is commentary. In 1975, the state of Tennessee designated the Blue Spring as a protected natural resource. In 1980, the Grassy Cove Blue Spring Agricultural Cooperative was established, distributing mineral water to farms across the county through a pipe system my sons helped engineer. The land I had bought for $1 was assessed that year at $47,000. I died in the spring of 1983 at 62. They found me in the garden, kneeling beside the original Brandywine bed, the same patch of soil where I'd planted that first smuggled seedling 46 years before. My hands were in the dirt. The spring was flowing blue and steady behind me. My daughter said I looked like I was planting something. My son said I looked like I was listening to the ground. The spring is still flowing, still blue, still cold, still sweet, still carrying its payload of dissolved mountain up from the dark. My grandchildren run the cooperative now. The blue spring water irrigates over 200 acres in the cove. The Brandywine tomatoes, still grown from seeds saved every year since 1937, still watered with the same blue water, are sold at farmers' markets in Nashville and Knoxville for prices that would have made Mr. Henshaw at the county assessor's office drop his pen. On the stone beside the spring, carved by Orrin's steady hand in 1943, are the words, "This water was always good. We were afraid of the color." Flora wasn't. So let me ask you something. What blue spring are you avoiding? What gift has the world been offering you? Strange, unfamiliar, colored in a way that makes people warn you away. That might be exactly the thing you need. Because here's what the spring taught me. Fear and wisdom look nothing alike, but people confuse them constantly. The farmers of Grassy Cove weren't wise to avoid the blue water. They were afraid. And fear dressed up as wisdom kept them from the most fertile water source in the county for 100 years. It took a girl with $1 and no other options to kneel at the edge and drink. Sometimes the things that look the most dangerous are the most nourishing. Sometimes the water that's the strangest color is the sweetest. Sometimes the land that nobody wants is the land that has been waiting, patient and generous, for someone brave enough or desperate enough to plant a single seed and see what happens. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the blue springs in your own life that you've been walking past because someone told you the water was bad, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who drank when others wouldn't and grew what others couldn't. Your dollar land is out there. Your blue spring is flowing. Stop listening to the people who've never tasted the water. Kneel down and drink.